They once spat into his soup just because he was blind. But then a man stopped, tasted, and wept. Because in each spoonful of groundnut soup there was childhood, a mother, a memory. He couldn't see, but he touched hearts. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that reach into your soul. Before the accusations came crashing down, I truly believed that flavor could touch the heart, even if it came from a blind man. The market in Kumasi wakes before the sun. By the time light begins to stretch its fingers over the rusted rooftops, the air is already thick with voices, sharp laughing bargaining. Smoke from small fires curls around the ankles of women roasting plantains. Children run barefoot between crates of tomatoes and yams. A man pushes a cart of smoked fish, his voice lost in the chorus of chaos. Vendors yell with the kind of urgency only hunger understands. Hands grab eyes, scan coins, clink. The world here is noise and need. But somewhere just beyond the noise, a different rhythm. Down a narrow alley soaked in old oil and yesterday's rain, a single door sits crooked in its frame. It opens into darkness. Not the soft kind, not the gentle hush of night. This darkness is thick. It breathes. Inside, the air is warm, almost too warm. It smells of roasted peanuts and something deeper. Sweat. Wood smoke. A memory left too long in the heat. A flame dances under a dented aluminum pot, its lid rattling faintly. The soup inside bubbles low thick with groundnut paste, palm oil, and thyme. And next to it, Kofi. He stands without sight. His eyes, pale and unmoving, reflect nothing of the world. But his hands are alive. One hovers just inches above the bubbling pot, feeling the heat. The other holds a long, worn spoon, its wood darkened from years of use. He stirs slowly, lips pressed tight in concentration. No recipe, no clock, only instinct. He tilts his head, breathing in. His nose searches for balance. Has the onions melted enough? Did the dried fish bloom into the broth? Is the chili daring or cruel? He tastes. His tongue knows what his eyes never did, how to find light in what burns. A noise outside, footsteps, heavy, impatient. Then the slam of a hand against the door. Kofi, no answer. The door creaks open. Daylight crashes into the room like a drunk guest. A man appears in the frame, tall shirt, half-buttoned, anger preloaded in his throat. "You cooking again?" the man says, stepping inside. "In this place, this stinkhole." He moves toward the stove, sniffing exaggeratedly, as if disgust is something he must wear on his face. Kofi doesn't flinch. He lifts the lid, slightly stirs again. "You blind man? You don't even know what's in that pot," the man continues. "And you selling this to people. You want us all to die." Still no answer. The man glances around the room at the soot-stained walls, the cracked floor tiles, the shelf with mismatched jars. "Look at this. Rats would cook better than this," he spits. Kofi turns off the flame. Slowly. "Say something, blind man," the man sneers. "Or is shame the only spice you've got left?" Silence. The man pulls a crumpled Sadie note from his pocket and throws it on the ground. "Here, take your dirty money." He turns and walks out, laughter echoing in the alley like a slap. Kofi kneels. His fingers touch the note trace, the corners fold it carefully, and place it in a tin beside the stove. The tin is almost full. He wipes his hands, turns the flame back on. The soup resumes its soft bubbling as if nothing ever happened. Kofi breathes deep. He reaches for a jar marked with faint dots, his own version of Braille etched by a knife. He unscrews the lid and lets chili flakes fall into the pot, red like warning. Then ginger, ground finely between his palms. He stirs again. The smell deepens. It grows teeth. "They say I should not cook," he says softly to no one. "But this kitchen is my only pair of eyes." He stands straight, wipes sweat from his brow. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but memory. He steps to a corner shelf and opens a wooden box. Inside, 3 old bowls, hand-carved edges worn smooth by time and washing. He picks one, places it on the counter. From outside, a small voice, sweet, shy. "Uncle Kofi, is the soup ready?" He doesn't answer. Instead, he ladles soup into the bowl, careful even. The steam rises into his face. He smiles, places the bowl at the edge of the window. A moment later, it's gone. Kofi returns to the pot, adds a bit of water, adjusts the flame. Every movement is deliberate. Every decision, a quiet defiance. Then his hand slips. The spoon crashes to the floor. A sharp gasp escapes him. He crouches to retrieve it, but instead his hand lands in a puddle of spilled broth. He winces. The burn is sharp, but he doesn't pull away. He sits on the floor for a long time. In the silence, the soup still boils. "They call my hands dirty," he whispers. But these hands learned how to feed a body in the dark. These hands never asked to be seen, only to be useful. He gets up, cleans the spill, dips a fresh spoon into the pot, and stirs again. Outside, a rooster crows. Time passes. Then another knock. Not loud, just enough. He opens the door slightly. A woman stands there, thin, tired, her dress worn at the hem. She holds a plastic bottle in her hands. "They say you make the best groundnut soup," she says. "They say it tastes like forgiveness." Kofi nods once, takes the bottle, fills it, returns it. She presses money into his palm more than it costs. He shakes his head, tries to return it. She pushes his hand away gently. "For what they've said to you," she whispers. "This is not just for soup." She leaves. He stands in the doorway for a moment longer. The sun is higher now and the alley is louder. But inside the kitchen, it is still dark. Still warm. Still sacred. He returns to his pot, stirs slowly, breathes deeply. The flame flickers under the broth, dancing like it always has, without judgment. He speaks again, this time with steadiness. "I don't cook to prove. I don't cook to beg. I cook because something inside me refuses to stay silent." Then quietly he begins to hum. It's a lullaby one his mother sang when his world was still new and dark and kind. The steam rises. His face softens. And for a moment, just one, his kitchen feels like the only honest place in the world. Because in this kitchen, he is not the blind man. He is the chef, the maker, the witness of boiling truths. And if the world will not taste what he offers, then let the fire be enough. Let the smell carry the story. Let the soup do what words cannot. Because there is a kind of healing in feeding yourself even when no one else believes you should. And there is a kind of love that only lives in the things you make with your own two hands in the dark, without applause. Kofi lifts the lid one last time, smiles. "I see better here than I ever did out there," he says. And the pot answers softly, steadily, like it always does. The scent of the soup lingered in the air, thick and comforting, even as the shadows on the wall stretched longer. Kofi sat beside the low wooden table, his fingers gently tracing the edge of a wooden bowl. It had once belonged to his mother. His thumb found the chip on the rim, and that was all it took. Memory cracked open like a seed. He could still feel the dirt floor of his childhood home beneath his bare feet. The air then had been clearer, thinner, full of the scent of open fields and warm nuts drying in the sun. He was born in a village that didn't have a name big enough for the map. Just lines of houses made of mud and hope tucked between cassava patches and silence. He didn't know he was blind until he was 4. He thought the world simply didn't have faces. His earliest memories were sounds. Goats bleating in the morning, the clink of a calabash against the well. His mother's humming voice as she crushed roasted groundnuts with a stone. His father, a fisherman with a voice like gravel and hands always damp with lake water, died when Kofi was 5. His canoe went out after a storm and never returned. That day the air had smelled like wet wood and grief. His mother didn't cry loud. She didn't scream. She simply lit a fire and roasted more nuts. Then she took his hands and said, "We do not stop cooking when the world stops breathing. We cook until it breathes again." She taught him how to tell the difference between fresh lac and the ones too dry. "Feel this," she would say, pressing a small nut into his palm. "Too smooth, too light, no flavor. That one's no good." She made him touch the steam from boiling water, not too close, just enough. That is what heat feels like when it is ready. That is when onions cry sweetly into the oil. She taught him to listen to the crackle of shea butter hitting the pan. "That's the sound of flavor being born," she whispered. He learned to map the kitchen in steps. 3 steps to the pot. Turn. 2 steps to the oil. Reach, touch, stir, wait, breathe, taste, adjust. They cooked together like dancers without music. He knew her by the rustle of her wrapper, the click of her bangles, the weight of her presence beside him. At night, she would lie next to him and describe the moon, what it looked like, where it was hiding, how it changed shape like a shy woman in a crowd. He never saw it, but he loved it. And then she started coughing. It began as a whisper in her chest. Then it became a storm. He could hear it when she bent to stir the pot, how her breath broke mid-sentence. She still cooked, still taught. But her steps grew heavier, her silences longer. One night, he woke to find her sitting outside in the dark, face tilted to the sky. "Are you watching the moon?" he asked. She didn't answer. He reached out. Her hand was cold. And in the morning, she was gone. Just like that. Kofi didn't bury her. The neighbors did. He was too small, too blind, too lost. They gave him leftover food, old clothes, told him he could stay in a cousin's house. But the cousin didn't want him. Said a blind boy eats more than he earns. So one night, Kofi walked. He walked until the dust stopped being red and turned into gray. He walked into Kumasi with nothing but his mother's cooking bowl and a memory of ginger in his nose. He slept near the market at first, curled under benches, learned the scent of dawn from the smell of rising smoke. People stepped over him like a sack. Others threw coins at him like guilt. He begged. But even that takes vision. And then one day, he heard it a shuffle beside him, soft, hesitant. Then something warm pressed against his foot. He froze. A nose sniffed his toes. Then a gentle whine. A dog, skinny ribs showing eyes more tired than a child should ever see. She licked his fingers, then laid beside him like it was the only place that made sense. He named her Nia. She didn't speak. But she never left. She began to lead him not by leash, not by command, just by presence. When she walked forward and stopped, he knew she found a path. When she barked low, he knew someone was near. Nia was not trained. She was not raised to help the blind. But she chose him, and that was enough. With Nia, he stopped being invisible. Vendors noticed him more. Some threw him scraps. Others gave him bones for her. He began helping a plantain seller peeling sorting. He couldn't see the difference, but he could feel it in the firmness, the temperature. He didn't ask for pity, just a space. And slowly, people forgot to mock him. He saved, coin by coin, until he could buy a pot. Then a stove, then a spot in the back alley just wide enough for dreams. Nia always sat beside the stove, watching, guarding. And when he stirred his first pot of groundnut soup in Kumasi, it wasn't just food, it was a resurrection. He cooked with his mother's hands. He tasted with her tongue. And Nia, she became his eyes. One night it rained heavy. The kind of rain that makes silence feel like thunder. Kofi had just covered the pot when Nia started barking. Low, sharp, then panicked. He froze. She ran out. He waited. Called her name. Waited again. She didn't return. He searched in the morning, fingers scraping along alley walls. Asking, hoping. But Nia was gone. Stolen, someone said. Or maybe she chased a rat into the street and didn't come back. He never found out. But he kept cooking, not because the world asked him to, but because it was the only thing that didn't leave. Now, sitting in the kitchen years later, Kofi lifted the same bowl his mother once handed him. He touched the chip again. "Nia," he whispered. "Mama." The flame flickered gently. Outside, the world roared on. But inside, in this small, dark kitchen, Kofi's memory boiled beside the broth. And the story was not over. Not yet. Not as long as he could still stir. Not as long as someone somewhere was hungry for more than just food. Because sometimes a blind man doesn't need eyes to see. He just needs heat, silence, and something worth remembering. And in that moment, Kofi remembered everything. He stood, lifted the ladle, and began again. The sun had barely lifted itself from behind the hills when Kofi arrived at the edge of the Kumasi market, carrying his life in 3 objects: a dented aluminum pot, a folded wooden stool, and a cloth bundle filled with spice jars wrapped in leaves. Nia walked ahead of him, tail swaying slowly, guiding him as she always did, without noise, without doubt. He found the corner no one wanted, wedged between a broken fence and the back wall of a mechanic's stall. There was barely room for his body, let alone business. But the smell of petrol couldn't drown the memory of lack and ginger burning low in his mother's kitchen. So he unpacked the pot, cleaned the lid with the hem of his shirt, and lit the flame. He didn't need space, just a fire, just breath, just time. The soup began, as it always did, with silence. Groundnuts mashed to a paste, thinned with water, carried in old plastic containers, stirred until the color turned from dull tan to deep gold. Then came the dried fish, the heat of local pepper, the oily whispers of palm and spice. He sat and waited, but the market didn't notice him. Vendors shouted on either side of him, baskets of fruit and trays of fried yam blocking him like trees shadowing a single candle. People rushed by without looking. Some wrinkled their noses at the strange smell. Others glanced down at Naya and stepped wider around him, as if poverty were contagious. He sold one bowl, then none. That first week he ate more of his soup than he sold. Then came the laughter. Children too young to understand shame, but old enough to be cruel, would toss stones near his stool, daring each other to touch the blind man's pot. "He can't see us," they whispered, then ran when Naya growled low in her throat. One boy dropped a dead lizard into his pot and called it seasoning. Another tried to spit into the soup while Kofi stirred, thinking it a joke. The traders nearby never helped. "He's lucky we even let him sit here," one said. "He's cooking with his ears," another laughed. "Next, he'll be painting with his elbows." Kofi said nothing. He tightened the cloth on his jars. He stirred longer. He let the burn on his fingers guide the temperature. He began arriving earlier, hoping to catch the market before its heart turned cold. Some days he made 2 cedis, others nothing, and still he cooked, not because he believed it would save him, but because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. Then came the day of the tourists. A small bus wheezed to a stop at the edge of the market. It was dusty white, its windows smeared with fingerprints and hope. A guide stepped out first, sunglasses and clipboard in hand, followed by 8 or 9 people speaking in rapid, excited voices. Their cameras clicked before their feet touched the ground. Vendors straightened their trays. Some lifted children onto tables, dressed them quickly in bright fabric, hoping to sell a photograph for a few dollars. But Kofi didn't see them. He only smelled the change in the air, sunscreen, perfume, foreign soap. Naya's ears twitched. She stood, alert. The tourists moved through the market like wind, sudden, curious, loud. And in their midst, a man lagged behind, not because he wasn't interested, but because he was listening. Watching. Marco DeSantis, a chef from Rome. Wide hands, tired eyes. He had seen every spice there was to see, eaten every kind of street food from Bangkok to Marrakesh. But what caught his attention now was not the pot or the smell or the blind man sitting quietly beside a flickering stove. It was the dog. Naya had placed herself between the tourists and the pot, body low. Low eyes fixed like a soldier at the gate. One man reached for the ladle, laughing, trying to take a photo, and Naya growled. Not loud, not vicious, just a sound sharp enough to freeze the air. Marco stopped walking. He watched the dog, the blind man, the steam rising in ribbons. "Who is this?" he asked the guide. "Just a blind man," the guide said. "He sits here every day. Tries to sell some soup. Never sells much. The smell is strange, but some say he used to live with dogs." Marco didn't laugh. He stepped closer. The others had moved on to a basket of kente cloth. Marco knelt near the fire. "What's cooking?" he asked gently. Kofi turned toward the voice, his nose lifting slightly. "Groundnut," he said. Marco nodded. "I can smell the ginger. And dried fish." Kofi tilted his head. "Small ones. Sun-dried. Smoked for 2 days." Marco smiled. "You use palm oil?" "Yes, but only after it speaks." Marco chuckled. "And what did it say today?" "That it was angry, so I added onions." They sat in silence for a moment, just the crackling of the fire and the shifting of steam. Nia eased her posture, sensing the tension pass. Kofi lifted the lid. Marco leaned in. The smell hit him like a memory he didn't know he had, thick, deep, layered. The groundnut was earthy, but brightened by the chili. The fish was background music, not the lead singer. It was balanced, complex. He had tasted food in 5-star kitchens that tried half as hard. Kofi ladled a small portion into a gourd, held it out. Marco took it, tasted. His eyes closed, not in show, in shock. "This is—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, pressed it into Kofi's hand. "I leave Ghana in 2 weeks," he said. "But I want to come back. I want to learn. From you." Kofi didn't answer, just held the card. Marco stood, smiled once more, and walked away. The others never even noticed. That evening, Kofi sat beside his fire long after the pot was empty. Not from sales, but from belief. He turned the card over in his hand, again and again, as if the edges would whisper something new. Naya rested her head on his knee. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. Not because someone finally saw him, but because someone had finally tasted his truth, and it was enough. That night, he added more chili to the next day's soup, not for heat, but for courage. Because maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to feel what he had always known, that even in the darkness there is flavor, and even in rejection there is fire. And he would keep cooking, even if no one came. Especially if no one came, because his hands still remembered the warmth, and now so did someone else. The air that morning was ordinary, thick with heat dust, and the scent of yesterday's rain still clinging to the edges of the market roofs. Nothing about the sky suggested that anything would change. But Kofi felt it. Not in his bones, not in the wind, but in the way the silence before dawn held itself a little tighter than usual, like the world was waiting to exhale. He had arrived earlier than normal. Naya was restless, circling more than usual, her nose twitching toward the alley like she could sense something coming. The pot was already simmering. The broth today had a different depth. He had soaked the groundnuts overnight in silence, crushed them slowly, while humming the tune his mother once whispered in the evenings. He had let the ginger rest in salt, let the fish dry a little longer than he usually did. He wasn't sure why. He stirred slowly with hands that remembered, and then footsteps. Not rushed, not uncertain. Marco. He was alone this time. No guide, no group, no camera hanging around his neck. Just a man in a linen shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows, walking like someone who had something to prove and nothing to lose. Kofi turned slightly, his head lifting toward the sound. "You came back," he said simply. "I couldn't leave without tasting it again. Not properly." Marco knelt beside the stove, eyes scanning the way the steam curled from the edges of the lid. Naya didn't growl this time. She sat beside Kofi, still and calm, as if she too understood the gravity in the man's return. "You cook like you remember the beginning of things," Marco said. "Not just food, but origin." Kofi didn't reply. He only reached for the gourd and ladled the soup. This time Marco didn't sip it standing. He sat on the dusty wooden stool opposite Kofi, held the bowl in both hands, like something sacred, and then he tasted, slowly. The camera in his pocket, he didn't reach for it. The world narrowed to flavor. Time bent around sensation. First came the warmth. Not heat, but something softer. A hug made of spice. Then the earthiness of the groundnut grounding ancient. The fish followed not as a command, but a suggestion. Then ginger. Then a whisper of something floral. He couldn't place it. Not immediately. It lingered at the roof of his mouth like an old memory. He swallowed, blinked. "This," he said barely above a whisper. "This is the purest taste I've ever known." Kofi didn't respond. He had heard enough words in his life that didn't stay. He let silence do the work. Marco set the bowl down, took out his phone. "I'm not here to make you famous," he said. "But this deserves to be heard." He turned on the camera. "This is Marco DeSantis," he began, voice low, "and I just had something that's going to haunt me in the best way for the rest of my life." He panned the camera slowly across the pot. The rising steam, the scarred hands of Kofi still holding the ladle. Then the dog sitting beside him, loyal and still. The stool, the soot-stained walls, the quiet fire. "No Michelin star can measure this," he said. "No star can explain why I can taste memory, sorrow, joy, and strength in a single mouthful." He looked at Kofi. This man is blind, but he sees things most chefs never will. He paused, "And you will too. If you ever find yourself in Kumasi, find this pot. It will find you back." He stopped recording. No filters, no edits, just truth. He uploaded the video before even leaving the alley. By evening, the clip had 11,000 views. By morning, it had 100,000. And by the end of that week, Kofi's corner, once ignored, once mocked, had a line. Not just tourists. Locals, students, housewives, taxi drivers, curious children. People who had once stepped around him now waited quietly, holding plastic bowls and old Tupperware, exchanging glances and whispered guesses about what exactly was in the soup. Some came just to see if it was real. Some came with doubt. All left silent. The man who sold onions nearby muttered, "Must be some kind of trick." The girl who once kicked dirt near his feet now watched him with a strange softness in her eyes. Kofi didn't speak more than usual. He still stirred slowly, still let the palm oil speak first. He raised his prices slightly, but the soup didn't change, because it was never made to impress, only to witness. Marco returned once more, just once. Long enough to kneel beside the fire and say, "They'll come for you now. They'll want more. Just promise you won't let them name your hands what they never bothered to understand." Kofi smiled. "I never cooked for names." The camera crew arrived 2 days later. Then the newspaper. Then the woman from the city who asked with lipstick too bright, "Can we franchise this?" Kofi shook his head. "You can buy the pot, but not the heat." They laughed. He didn't. Naya, still beside him, barked once. Short, sharp, enough to silence the street. People came and went, but Kofi stayed. Every morning, same time, same pot, same hand-carved ladle, same gourd bowl. And yet nothing was the same, because for the first time in his life, the world came to him not with mockery, not with pity, not with passing curiosity, but with hunger, a hunger deeper than food, a hunger for meaning, for proof that something real still exists in a world filtered and false. And in a quiet corner of Kumasi, where smoke rose from the same spot every dawn, Kofi gave them just that, one bowl at a time. The rain came without warning. One moment the market baked under the Kumasi sun, and the next clouds rolled in like a held breath finally exhaled. Kofi didn't move from his spot. He kept stirring the soup, the rhythm unbroken. Rain didn't scare him. The fire knew how to fight back. But that day, something else stirred in the steam. Something that had nothing to do with the broth. Marco returned. His voice was different, full serious, like a cord strung too tight. He didn't waste time. "There's a culinary institute in Accra," he said, kneeling again by the pot. "They invited me to teach a workshop for international chefs. But I said no." Kofi paused ladle mid-turn. "I told them there's someone else they need to hear from. Someone who understands fire, even if he's never seen it. I told them your name." The words hung in the steam. "They want you, Kofi, as a guest instructor. Just a few days, just to share. You don't have to become anyone else." Kofi didn't answer right away. Accra was a city wrapped in noise, ambition, and roads he had never walked. He had never even left Kumasi since he arrived years ago. His world was this stove, this corner, this air. And Nia. "I don't belong there," he said finally. Marco sighed. "You belong wherever your soup can speak. You think Accra won't understand? Let them try to ignore you once they taste." But Kofi said nothing more. That night, he lay beside Nia in their usual spot behind the mechanic's shack. Rain tapped the tin roof gently. Nia's breath was slow, steady. Kofi placed his palm on her ribs, counting each rise like a hymn. He thought of Accra, of the noise, of the questions, of rooms full of sighted people waiting for a blind man to teach them about taste. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no wind to trust. The next morning, the market was wet, restless. Vendors grumbled, covering their goods with plastic sheets. Children kicked puddles. Smoke curled around soaked yams. Then came the scream. A girl first. Then another voice. Then barking. Then silence. Kofi dropped the spoon. He knew that bark. He ran arms out, following the sound like a thread in the dark. He found her in the alley. Nia. Her body, limp ribs rising sharp and uneven. Blood near her flank. Her front paw bent wrong. Beside her, a rock stained dark. Footsteps long gone. He knelt, lifted her gently. She didn't whimper, just looked up at him with pain already old in her eyes. Someone whispered from behind a stall. It was Kojo, the plantain boy. He said the dog chased away customers. Kofi didn't turn around. He wrapped Naya in his cloth and carried her back to the fire, his arms trembling not from weight, but from the breaking. She didn't eat for 2 days, just lay still. Every time Kofi stirred the soup, he listened for her breathing. It became his new rhythm. The customers came anyway, but he barely tasted the broth, barely noticed the coins, and on the 3rd day, Marco returned again, sat silently, then placed a worn leather bag beside the pot. In there, he said, is a train ticket and a letter from the director of the school. Kofi didn't touch it. Marco continued, I know what silence means for you, but sometimes silence is just fear trying to dress like peace. Kofi wiped the edge of the pot quietly. Who will feed her if I go? Then bring her. They won't allow dogs. They will if it's you. Silence again. Then Kofi stood, walked to the bench, and touched Naya's fur. She blinked, barely lifting her head. He whispered something she would understand before he ever understood it himself. We're leaving, he said. They've taken enough from us here. That night, he didn't light the fire. He packed the pot, wrapped it carefully in cloth. He folded his ladle. He closed every jar and kissed the top of the wooden gourd bowl that once belonged to his mother. The next morning, before the market woke, he lifted Nia gently into a makeshift sling across his chest. The first step out of the alley was the hardest. Not because of weight, but because it meant he was finally choosing to walk towards something instead of away. And in that quiet moment, with only the sound of his breath and the echo of the flame now gone, Kofi became more than a cook. He became the answer to a question the world had never known it needed to ask. The walls of the Culinary Institute in Accra were too white, too sterile, too quiet. The ceilings were high-lined with silver vents and rows of pristine stoves that had never known hunger. Every scent in the room smelled of sterilized ambition, polished steel, processed garlic, imported oil. Kofi stood in the center of it, his wooden ladle wrapped in cloth, his pot in one hand, Naya curled by his feet. She was still limping from the injury, but she wouldn't let him walk a step without her. The students had already started whispering before he entered. Some were local, young, loud, determined. Others wore white coats, too stiff to bend at the elbows. A few had accents that didn't belong to Ghana. They came from countries that built entire empires on cuisine now, sitting cross-armed, eyebrows raised. And when they saw him blind, quiet, barefoot in cracked sandals, carrying a dented aluminum pot, they laughed, loud enough for it to sting. This is a joke, right? One said, the smirk sharp in his tone. A blind man to teach us cooking. What's next? A deaf man to teach music. He's probably just here to give a speech. Kofi stood still. He could feel the heat rising to his face, the shame clawing up his chest like a beast long forgotten. He hadn't spoken a word yet, and already he felt smaller than the floor he stood on. Someone dropped a metal spoon just to see if he'd flinch. He didn't, but his hand clenched tighter around the pot. The head instructor introduced him briefly, called him a visiting master of traditional Ghanaian flavor, and quickly left as if not wanting to share the stage with embarrassment. Kofi opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. He thought of leaving, of turning around, of taking Naya and going back to the corner of the market, where at least the silence was honest. He turned slightly, heart racing. Then he heard a voice, Marco's, low and clear from the back of the room. You don't need eyes to teach flavor, he said. You teach from feeling, from memory, from pain. And if any of you came here just to follow a recipe, you're already in the wrong room. Silence. Kofi turned back. Slowly, his breath calmed. The pot in his hand no longer felt like a burden. He placed it gently on the nearest counter. I am not here to show you what food looks like, he said, voice steady now. I am here to show you what it feels like, what it means to taste with everything except your eyes. A few students scoffed. One rolled his eyes. Close them, Kofi said. They looked at him. He stepped forward. All of you, close your eyes. If you want to laugh, laugh with them shut. Marco crossed his arms, watching, waiting. One by one, reluctantly, the students closed their eyes. The air changed. Kofi walked slowly between them, his voice softer now. You hear that oil crackling? That's the voice of heat. The onions haven't screamed yet. When they do, you'll smell it. He took a clove of garlic, crushed it with the flat of his palm. Feel this. It's not just texture. It's story. This bulb grew in silence under the earth. You don't chop it. You wake it. He placed a pinch of ginger into one student's palm. The boy jumped slightly. That warmth on your skin. That's the future of your broth. Another student breathed in too quickly, startled. Then he stirred, with eyes still closed. And for the first time, the room was quiet, not from judgment, but from presence. Kofi moved back to his pot. He began to cook. Not for them, for the memory that brought him here. He added groundnut paste, palm oil, dried fish. He called one student forward. Your turn. Touch the steam, 1 inch above. What does it say? The student hesitated, then reached out. It's warm. Not enough, Kofi said. Listen again. The student paused, leaned in. It smells alive. Kofi smiled. He guided their hands, their ears, their instincts. For the next hour, they cooked blind, burned a little, laughed nervously, missed the pot sometimes. But something shifted, even the loudest student. The one who mocked him stood at the edge of his station, with hands cupped over a ladle, eyes closed, head tilted like he was praying. And when they tasted the final soup, each bowl a slightly different song, there was no more laughter, only stillness. Kofi stood at the front, hands resting on the edge of the counter, his pot now half empty, the room full of something unspoken. You thought cooking was about control, he said quietly. But it's about surrender. They didn't clap, not out of disrespect, but because no one wanted to break the spell. Marco approached later when the students had filed out in quiet wonder. You didn't teach them how to cook, he said. Kofi nodded. I taught them how to feel hungry. For the first time. He looked down at Naya resting beside him, her paw twitching in sleep. And I needed to remember it too. Outside, the sky over Accra burned gold with evening. But inside that white-walled room, something raw had been cooked open, and no one, least of all Kofi, would ever walk the same way again. The following Monday, the classroom was full before the sun had finished rising. Word had spread like spice in oil. No longer were students dragging their feet or sneaking glances at their phones. They sat forward, notebooks open, not to copy measurements, but to record moments. Even the staff had begun to listen. Kitchen assistants, who once wiped down unused stations, now paused in the corners, eyes trained on the man, with no sight but too much presence to ignore. Kofi didn't raise his voice. He never had to. He taught by listening, by placing his hand above a pan and asking, "What does this feel like to you?" He asked questions no one had heard in culinary school before. Not, "What's the recipe?" but "What is the memory behind this broth?" By the end of the second week, students were staying after hours. Not for grades, but to learn what the silence in their food had been missing. Then came the media. A radio host had heard about the blind chef teaching taste through heat and intuition. She visited in secret, ate quietly in the back of the room, asked no questions. But the next morning, her voice spread the story across Ghana. He sees more in flavor than I've ever seen on a plate. That same afternoon, a crew from a national news station arrived. They filmed Kofi as he stirred, filmed Naya sleeping beneath his station, filmed students standing in silence with their eyes closed, tasting soup in reverence. One segment turned to 10. Articles followed, then a podcast. And one afternoon, after a class filled with hushed awe, a man stood at the door of the school kitchen, dressed in a pressed white shirt, shoes too clean for the street. "I've been looking for you," he said. His voice was clipped but warm. "I run La Fonte. You've heard of it?" Kofi turned toward the sound. "I don't see much," he said, half smiling. La Fonte is Accra's oldest European-African fusion restaurant. We've hosted chefs from Paris, Tokyo, and Lagos, but we've never had anything like what I tasted yesterday. That soup." He paused. "I want to open a new kitchen. Not a menu, a movement, a blind kitchen." Silence. "We'll call it the Blind Taste. 1 table, 10 seats, no lights, no labels, only feeling." Kofi didn't move. His hands rested quietly on the edge of the counter, fingers finding a small chip in the wood. "I'm not interested in spectacle," he said. "This isn't a show," the man replied. It's a return. Kofi thought of the first bowl of soup he ever made with his mother. Thought of the way she placed his hands near the flame and whispered, "Trust this." "Trust?" He said nothing. The man placed a small envelope on the counter. "There's no contract in there, just an address. And the truth that Accra's ready to taste something it's never had before." Then he left. The room emptied slowly after that, but Kofi stayed behind, alone, with Naya curled beside him. He picked up the envelope, felt the edge, the weight. He opened it. Inside a single slip of paper, no logo, no bold font, just one sentence written in ink so deep it felt pressed into the page. "We don't need your eyes, we need your soul." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of the small room the school gave him. Naya's head rested on his thigh. The sounds of Accra buzzed just beyond the window traffic laughter life. He thought of Kumasi, of the alley, of the first time someone spit near his pot, of the silence that followed. He thought of every time he almost stopped. Then he thought of the students now waiting to learn from him, not out of pity, but because he had something they'd never tasted. He thought of the soup, how it had changed, but never betrayed him. By morning, he had made his choice. The next day, he entered the classroom, set the pot on the fire, and waited for silence. Then he said, "I will be leaving this school, but I'm not done teaching." A gasp from a student in the front row. He continued, "I've been asked to open a kitchen, not just for food, but for truth." He paused, "And I'll only do it if I can cook with no lights, no menu, no filters, just fire and feeling." The room was still, and then a sound rose from the back hands clapping. Slow, then joined, until the entire room stood applause thick like rain. That evening, he visited the restaurant. It was quiet closed, the tables covered in cloth. The man from before greeted him again, handed him keys. "It's yours. We'll start as soon as you're ready." Kofi turned toward the kitchen. His fingers touched the counter, the stove, the walls. Too clean. He asked for the lights to be removed, for the walls to be painted dark, for soundproofing in the dining room, so all that remained was the breath of steam and the music of boiling. He named the kitchen the Blind Taste, not because he could not see, but because the world had forgotten how to taste without watching. Opening night sold out in 1 hour. And Kofi, he stood beside the pot ladle in hand, Naya beside him once again. He didn't say much. He let the soup speak, and the world listened. Opening night arrived like a storm wrapped in velvet. By late afternoon, a crowd had already gathered outside the Blind Taste. Reporters, food critics, influencers, even political aides. Everyone wanted a seat, a story, a taste. The narrow street in front of the restaurant, once anonymous, pulsed with flashes from cameras and the electric hum of anticipation. Inside, the lights had been removed entirely per Kofi's request. Black curtains sealed the windows. Candles were offered only to the servers guiding guests to their places. The dining room whispered in shadows, intentionally muted, forcing the senses inward. Back in the kitchen, Kofi stood still. His hands were calm, but inside him, something shifted. This was no longer a quiet corner of Kumasi. This was a stage. And though he couldn't see them, he could feel the weight of the eyes that waited for him to become more than a man. Nia sat by the door, as always guarding, watching. The first guests entered. A hush spread as each person was guided to their seat. The menu, of course, was invisible. The bowls were handed one by one, and the first taste, his signature groundnut soup, was met with silence so deep it vibrated. Then came the first voice. "My God," someone said. "It tastes like memory." More murmurs followed. Then someone sobbed quietly, and still Kofi stirred. In the middle of this holy rhythm, the front door slammed open. A harsh voice broke through the dark. "I'm looking for the owner of this establishment." The kitchen doors swung open without warning. Heavy boots. A clipboard slammed against the counter. "I'm Inspector Adu, Accra Public Health. We've received a formal complaint." Kofi paused. Behind him, the pot simmered quietly. The inspector's voice was sharp, accusatory. We were informed by a local industry professional that this kitchen is operating below health standards, specifically under unsafe visual inspection conditions. Silence rippled across the room. Marco stepped forward. This is a sensory dining concept. Everything has been approved. The inspector turned. Was he approved? He pointed directly at Kofi. Kofi stood tall, but the words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. I need access to all prep areas, the inspector barked. And I want to speak to the chef. Now. Kofi stepped forward. The man looked him over, scanned his bare feet, his scarred hands, his clouded eyes. This is a professional kitchen, Adu said low. Not a charity? Behind him, a young journalist whispered into her phone. The story was already leaking. Kofi's voice came low-controlled. Everything is clean. Every ingredient was sourced with documentation. Ask. Adu sneered. Your senses aren't certified, sir. I'll be inspecting the premises thoroughly. He pulled on gloves, began checking drawers' surfaces. He ran his finger along a shelf and held it up to the light, then frowned. Too clean. He opened the spice jars, sniffed. Too fresh. And then he moved to the pot. Kofi's body tensed. I will need to inspect the contents. Kofi stepped forward. Please don't touch it. Let me serve it. You don't know its balance? Adu rolled his eyes. Is that a threat? No, it's a request. Too late. The inspector dipped a metal probe into the pot, stirring in the wrong direction. Kofi flinched. Marco shouted, Enough, this is harassment. But Adu smiled. I've seen enough. He turned. Due to the unorthodox methods of operation, lack of proper lighting for hygiene inspection, and inability to visually verify food preparation, this kitchen is temporarily suspended until further notice. A collective gasp filled the room. One guest stood. You're shutting him down, in the middle of dinner. Another shouted. He's cleaner than half the kitchens I've seen in Europe. But Adu had already pulled the official closure slip from his folder. He placed it on the counter. Kofi didn't speak. His hands reached blindly for the edge of the counter, gripping tight. Naya whimpered. The inspector walked out, heels sharp against the tile. The guests sat frozen. Marco tried to speak, but Kofi had already turned away. He walked toward the back door, one slow step after another, not rushed, but cracked. He opened the door, sat on the stone stoop. The night air was thick, humid. He didn't cry, he didn't shout, but inside, something collapsed. It wasn't the closure, it was the voice, not a charity. It brought back everything Kumasi, the laughter, the spitting, the boy who threw the lizard. The way people looked not at his hands, but through them. As if worth could only be tasted if it looked like theirs. He placed his face in his palms. This was the feeling he thought he had escaped. The darkness before the fire. He had walked so far, climbed so much. And now he was back at the edge of the same silence that once tried to erase him. Behind him, the soup still breathed, but Kofi did not. The kitchen was still, the pot untouched since the inspector's probe had gone quiet. Not because the fire died, but because something in Kofi had. He sat outside on the back step, head-bowed, fingers trembling in his lap. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind he used to trust. It was thick, heavy, crawling under his skin like the return of an old fear. He could hear the guests leaving. Murmurs, frustration, sympathy. But sympathy couldn't keep a kitchen open. And then footsteps. First one pair, then more, then many. Not running, not stomping, walking with purpose. Marco was first. Kofi didn't look up, but he knew that stride firm, measured full of fire, barely contained. Kofi, Marco said, kneeling beside him. You don't move. You don't go anywhere. We're not done. Behind him came the students. All of them, in their aprons. Some still smudged with oil and flour, having run straight from class. Some barefoot. Some with notebooks still clutched in hand. They formed a line in front of the kitchen entrance. Then came others. 2 servers from the restaurant across the street. A woman who used to sell oranges outside the institute. The man who helped fix the broken stovepipe last week. A street drummer who once exchanged a bowl of soup for a song. They didn't hold signs. They didn't yell. They just stood. One by one, they spoke. I've eaten food from chefs with medals, a student said. None of them taught me how to taste pain and joy in the same spoon. This man didn't teach me to cook, another said. He taught me how to feel hunger the way I felt it as a child. and how to respect it. He gave me back my hands, a third whispered. They used to shake when I held a knife. Now I stir with memory. Marco turned to the inspector, who had returned with 2 assistants ready to deliver the final papers. This is your health violation? Marco said, gesturing to the line of living, breathing testimony. And if you shut this down, you'll have to explain to the country why you killed the only kitchen where the blind lead with fire. The inspector frowned. He was about to speak when a quiet voice broke through the air. Not loud, but clear. Excuse me, the voice said. A murmur spread. Heads turned. It was an old woman, bent slow. Her skin the color of dusk, her fingers gripping the edge of a boy's shoulder as he led her gently toward the kitchen. She wore a faded blue scarf. Her eyes were gray with clouded pupils. She was blind. The boy, her grandson, carried a metal bowl. Is this where the soup is? She asked. The one from the radio. Kofi stood slowly. His body still felt like stone, but something in the old woman's voice stirred a breath back into his chest. The boy stepped forward. She hasn't eaten all day. She said she wanted to feel the food before she couldn't feel anything else. The inspector hesitated. The old woman turned her face toward the direction of Kofi's breath. I lost my sight 10 years ago, she said. And in all that darkness, food became color. She smiled. I heard about your soup. And I came because people say it gives them something back. Kofi moved. Slowly, quietly. He reached into the pot. The ladle didn't tremble. He scooped, gently poured into the boy's bowl, then stepped forward, guided by the weight of memory, and offered it to the woman. She took it in both hands, lifted the bowl to her lips. She didn't sip, she breathed. And in that breath, something shifted. Her eyes closed and she let the broth linger. Then one tear rolled down her cheek. I see my husband, she whispered. I see the firewood stove we used to share. I see my daughter's laugh, loud as the pepper in this spoon. She looked toward the inspector. I don't know what rules you follow, but this is not a kitchen. This is a memory being healed. The inspector blinked. He looked around at the students, the strangers, the woman still holding the bowl, like it held her life. He stepped forward, pulled the closure slip from his folder, then tore it in half. The kitchen is not in violation, he said flatly. There will be no suspension. A gasp, then cheers. Someone wept quietly in the back. Kofi didn't move. Not yet. He simply nodded. Once, then turned back to his pot. The fire was still alive. He stirred. The soup long still rose into motion once again. And outside, in the shadow of accusation, hope had returned not as noise, but as the steady sound of boiling. The road to his village was not paved. It was dust and memory. Kofi walked slowly, one hand on his walking stick, the other resting gently near Naya's shoulder. She no longer limped. Her stride was steady again, strong, silent. Each step beside him was a testament not just to healing, but to something deeper return. The trees that lined the footpath had grown taller, thicker, but the air still held the same perfume of roasted cassava and earth after rain. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Somewhere closer, firewood cracked under the weight of oil and heat. Kofi hadn't been back in years, not since the day they buried her, his mother. Now he came with silence as his offering, and soup as his prayer. They reached the grave just after noon. The sun hung low but warm. The earth had cracked around the base of the small rounded stone that bore no name, only a line carved by a neighbor's knife. The woman who cooked light into the dark. He knelt, not to cry, but to listen. Nia lay beside him, her head resting gently on her paws. I brought you soup, Kofi whispered. The same one we made that night when the roof leaked and the chili was too strong and you laughed so hard you dropped the spoon. He placed a wooden bowl near the base of the stone, steam rising. You were right, he said. They may not understand at first, but they will feel it. He paused. And Nia's still with me. You'd like her. As if on cue, Naya nudged his hand gently with her nose. The breeze shifted. Leaves rustled. Somewhere a bird called out. And for a moment he didn't feel alone, because grief never really leaves. It just learns to sit beside you more quietly. He stayed until the sky deepened, then stood slowly tracing the stone once more. Before he turned away, he spoke again. I used to think food was just flavor. Now I know it's the bridge between people who have no words left to share. The walk back to town was slower, but lighter. When Kofi and Nia returned to the blind taste, the line stretched around the corner. Not just guests, students. Some carried knives wrapped in cloth. Others held cookbooks, eyes full of questions. They had come from all over Kumasi, Tamale, Nairobi, even London. They didn't come for fame. They came for something no school could teach. Inside, the kitchen hummed with quiet rhythm. Marco was there guiding new hands. The air smelled of new spices some Kofi had never touched, but the heartbeat of the soup was still his. The walls hadn't changed. Still dark, still honest. He stepped inside, and the room stopped. A hush fell thicker than steam. Then a voice from the back, one of the first students he ever taught, Chef Kofi. The title sat strangely on his shoulders, but he nodded and stepped forward. He didn't give a speech. He walked to the pot, tasted, added a pinch of salt, then turned to the room. "You've come here thinking you want to learn how to cook," he said quietly. "But food is not instruction. It's inheritance." He pointed to the ladle. "When you lift this, you're holding every hand that fed you when you didn't know you were hungry. Every voice that hummed over a pot before you knew what grief smelled like." He touched his chest. "If you cook from here, the world will listen, even if it doesn't see you." Silence. Then one by one the students stepped forward, to stir, to taste, to begin. And outside, under the glow of evening, a new fire was lit. Not just in the kitchen, but in every heart brave enough to cook without seeing and feel without fear. The smell of roasted groundnut drifted softly into the air like incense from another life. It was late, long after most kitchens would have closed. But the blind taste was still alive, humming like a low, sacred chant. Not rushed, not loud, just steady, intentional. Inside, candles flickered against the deep walls, their light brushing gently against faces leaning forward in hushed conversation. The tables were full, every seat taken. Yet the room breathed like a single chest, quiet open, still listening. At the center stood Kofi. He was no longer a visitor in this space. He was its anchor. His hand hovered just inches above the pot-familiar territory now. He didn't need to hear the boil. The vibration of it had already moved up through the floor into his soles, into his knees, into his spine. The soup was ready. He reached for the ladle, slowly. The polished wood met his fingers like an old friend. He lifted it, dipped once into the pot, let the liquid rise, then paused. He tilted his face forward not to see, but to feel the warmth of the steam. It rose against his cheeks, dancing across the lines time had drawn on him. And then he smiled, a soft, quiet curve of his lips that no one could see, but everyone could feel. He whispered something not to the room, not to himself, but to the soup. A few guests noticed. They didn't say a word. The ones who had come before knew this moment wasn't a performance. It was communion. He poured the ladle into a ceramic bowl, the sound as soft as breath. The server beside him, trained not by manuals, but by weeks of silent observation, stepped forward, received it with both hands, and moved out toward the next table. Kofi didn't speak. He placed the ladle back, rested his palm on the rim of the pot. It was still hot, hotter than expected. The fire beneath it wasn't just flame. It was memory. It was survival. He exhaled, then finally he spoke, not loudly, but every syllable carried weight. "I don't see the light out there," he said, voice steady. "But inside me, it burns brighter than it ever has." There was no applause, just stillness, and that was enough. From the dining room came the sound of a spoon meeting a bowl, the clink of ceramic, the inhale before the first bite. Then silence again, followed by a low, uncontainable murmur of something deeper than satisfaction. A woman at the far corner set her spoon down and covered her mouth with her hand. Tears rolled down, not from sadness, but recognition. Across from her, her husband nodded slowly, eyes closed. At the center of it all, Kofi remained still. Beside him, Nia lay curled like a sentinel at rest. Her body healed her scar, barely visible beneath the fur that had grown back thick and golden. One ear twitched at the sounds around her, but her eyes were soft, peaceful. She didn't watch the room anymore. She just listened, like Kofi had taught her. A young couple raised their bowls in silent gratitude. Two women near the entrance held hands. Neither said a word, but they didn't need to. This wasn't a restaurant anymore. It was a threshold. People came here not to eat, but to remember what hunger really meant. Kofi stepped back slightly, letting the fire keep singing its low song without him. He could feel the rhythm of the room, how it pulsed, not with noise, but presence. It was the first time in years he felt the absence of fear in a room full of strangers. He turned slightly, walked slowly toward the back corner where he usually rested during rushes. His cane tapped gently in rhythm. His body moved like a question long answered. He sat. For the first time all day, he sat. Nia lifted her head and moved to rest it across his foot. He reached down, fingers brushing her ears. "You're still my eyes, you know," he said quietly. "But I think I can finally carry the rest." And then darkness. Not in the kitchen, but on the screen. Fade. A new image appeared. Daylight. Laughter. A small courtyard behind the restaurant, converted into an outdoor classroom. Children, young blind, vibrant, stood in aprons too big for them, sleeves rolled up to elbows. A table was filled with ingredients: yams, peppers, onions, ginger. No fire yet. Just preparation. Kofi stood among them, ladle in hand, tapping gently against the counter to get their attention. "Today," he said, "we don't need eyes. We only need courage." The kids giggled. He guided a young girl's hands over a yam. "Feel that it's not ready to be cut. It still holds too much water. Let it sit in the sun for 1 more hour." Another boy leaned over a bowl of pepper. "How do I know if it's too much?" he asked. Kofi smiled. "Smell it again. If it makes you blink twice, it's enough." The boy blinked 3 times. They both laughed. The camera pulled back. From above, the courtyard looked like a garden not of vegetables, but of healing. And in the center, Kofi moved slowly, hand resting on each child's shoulder, guiding them not toward recipes, but toward themselves. Voiceover. His voice, soft, honest. "We're not here to cook perfect food. We're here to remember we're still alive. We're here to make fire from nothing. To feed each other even in the dark." Final shot, one girl stirs a pot, while blindfolded, her face glowing with pride. Behind her, Kofi nods. Then darkness. One line appears on screen. "To taste is human. To feel is sacred."